Hi class, and welcome to lecture 9. We're continuing on with our discussion on the 3 branches of government. Today we're going to continue that with the executive branch and the evolution of the presidency. You'll have to excuse me, I'm still recovering from a cold, so I'm sorry if my voice begins to give out. So right away, the role of the president is extraordinarily complex. So I think it helps to break it down into 7 different areas. And your textbook does this as well, you'll probably notice. Those 7 roles being commander-in-chief, top diplomat, first legislature, chief bureaucrat, economist-in-chief, head of state, and party leader. So let's digest these, go through them one by one, starting with commander-in-chief. The president of the United States is the foreign policy and military leader of the largest military in the world, largest military, most powerful military, arguably of all time. And as such, as the president's role, commander-in-chief can send troops up in anywhere in the world for up to 60 days without congressional approval. So this is somewhat unique, somewhat not unique, but somewhat unique in the fact that the president, who is indeed a civilian, controls the military, not a top-ranking general. And part of the reason for this is to keep those 2 entities separate and to maintain civilian control over the military. Sometimes you'll see in countries like maybe Egypt or Pakistan, where the military becomes too powerful and is too separate from the government, it eventually becomes more powerful than the government. We've seen that in Pakistan, where the military essentially acts as its own entity. We've seen it in Egypt, where there was a military coup and they took over the government of the country. So we mentioned this in our Congress lecture, but only Congress can declare war. That is an enumerated right, constitutional right that Congress has. I also mentioned that the last time the United States actually declared war was in World War II, despite the fact that we've been involved in many wars since then, including the ones I've listed here, with the number of US deaths. I'd have to double check the Afghanistan and Iraq deaths. They might be, unfortunately, a little bit higher now with everything that had gone out with us pulling out of Afghanistan. So the ability to declare war, again, is a congressional right. But as I mentioned before, the president can send troops anywhere in the world for up to 60 days without congressional approval. After that 60 days, according to the War Powers Act of 1973, they must get congressional approval to continue to have those troops there. Congress put that in place in 1973 just to put a check on the presidency. You know, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. They were uncomfortable with Nixon, or really any president, having that ability to continue a war without congressional approval. So Nixon actually vetoed the War Powers Act, and Congress, in a rare act, unified and overrode that veto. So if a president vetoes a bill, Congress can override the veto if 2/3 of members of both houses choose to do so. So we have a rare instance of bipartisanship where Congress gets together and overrides Nixon's veto, and thus we still have the War Powers Act in existence, though many presidents sometimes push the limits of what is considered conflict. We've seen Clinton and Bush and even Obama kind of push the limits of the War Powers Act. Okay, so that's the first role, the president, commander-in-chief. Let's talk about the second role, top diplomat. The president is leader in foreign affairs, and this is pretty obvious, right? The president can establish informal alliances, maybe we might call them handshake agreements, called executive agreements. They're non-binding, they're non-official. Official treaties must be signed and approved by Congress. But beyond that, beyond these unofficial agreements, the president is also the figurehead of your country, right? It's the representative of your country, and the relationships, or the friends and enemies they make across the globe really matter in diplomatic relations and foreign affairs. Okay, so you want someone at the helm of your country who's going to use that persuasion to help your country to hopefully foster peace. The third role of the president is as first legislator. Well, you know from our last lecture that only Congress can pass laws. However, the president will often what we call sponsor bills, meaning they'll work with members of Congress to formulate legislation. That Congress member will put it through Congress, and then it may or may not become law. So when you think of something like Obamacare, right, that's a piece of legislation. Why do we call it Obamacare? Because he was instrumental in formulating that policy and contributing to that policy, which was then submitted by a Democratic congressperson. Okay. So every year, the president will give what we call the State of the Union. It's an address, a speech that essentially outlines what they want to see Congress pass throughout the year. Okay, this is the president's plan, what they would like to see in cooperation with Congress completed throughout the next year. The fourth role of the president, again, there's a lot of roles. It's a very complex office. The chief bureaucrat, of course, the president is the head of the entire executive branch, which has many, many agencies, many employees. The executive branch is in charge of enforcing laws. So Congress passes laws, the executive branch enforces laws. So we have to have what we call a large bureaucracy in place for law enforcement, whether these be federal agencies, things like the CIA, the DEA, or even things like going to get your license renewed, right? All those are government agencies. The fifth role is economist in chief. The president, for better or worse, fair or not, is seen as the head manager of our domestic economy, and as thus deals with national budget and fiscal problems. So this might not be fair, right? The scope of the president is maybe more limited than we think. I mean, the president can't pass laws, they can't pass executive orders, and Congress passes the budget technically. But for better or worse, and this is why we've seen the president become perhaps so involved in the economy, even recommending a budget to Congress, is because perhaps above anything else, economic strength is what makes or breaks a president's reelection bid and their popularity. So if there's a good economy, most times that president is going to be popular and get reelected. And if there's a poor performing economy, the opposite, or less likely to get elected. So we've shown as a people, as a nation, what we care about most in the United States is economic strength. Because when it comes down to it, you have to eat, you have to feed your family, right? You're worried about the economy. So above all else, we want a strong economy, and we intrinsically tie that to the president. Next, we have the president as the head of state. This is a symbol of U.S. authority. So let's not confuse this with the head of government, which the president is also, right? So if you go to a country like England, they have a head of state in the prime minister, and they have a head of state in the queen. They had a head of government in the prime minister. They're separate positions. We don't have that, obviously. We don't have a king or a queen. So both those head of state and head of government are both embodied by the president. The head of government is the official role, getting things done, running our country. The head of state is a symbolic role. And with this comes, somewhat silly things like pardoning the turkey. Every Thanksgiving, the president, they'll let a bunch of turkeys on the front lawn and he'll pick one to pardon, presidential pardon. Kind of a dumb thing they do, but kind of funny. Throwing the first pitch out of baseball games, sometimes they do. Just things that remind us that we are a unified nation. The president is the symbol of the United States. Here's a good example of perhaps the most important first pitch ever thrown. Not get political about George W. Bush. I know he's a controversial figure, but watch this video. I really want you to watch this video. This is immediately after 9/11, and it's a Yankees game, right? So the whole nation is watching. The Yankees are in the World Series, though they end up in the World Series that year. They would lose to the Diamondbacks in 7 games on a Luis Gonzalez single. In case you're a baseball fan, I remember I was watching it. What was I going with this? Sorry, I got caught up in baseball. But the point is, the whole nation was watching. It was in New York, and he goes out there and he throws a strike, right? So this is kind of the symbolic position behind being president. So watch this. It's pretty entertaining. And then after you're done watching this, Google worst first pitches ever. And if you want to laugh, right, 50 Cent might have the worst first pitch of all time. The 7th role and the final role we're going to discuss of the president is the party leader. And this is, again, another obvious one. The president is head of their party. Joe Biden is the head of the Democratic Party. President Trump was the head of the Republican Party. Although, we're seeing a lot of discord in both parties today. It is the president's job to maintain party unity, to make sure that congressmen and women vote by party line. And to do this, they'll often, be buddy with Congress men and women. And they'll even sometimes call them before a big vote to make sure they can count on their vote. So the president runs their party as well as the nation. Okay, so I mentioned in our congressional lecture that we're going to talk about demographics for every branch of government. Unfortunately, for this one, it's going to be rather short because there's not a lot of diversity in the president, and that is very slowly changing, but obviously it can only change every 4 years unless they're impeached. Every president had, except for two, have been self-described as Christians. And even that's debated. If you're curious what two, it's Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson. 98 point something percent of presidents have been white, right? Obama is the only Black president. And thus far, 100% of presidents have been male. Although our current vice president, Kamala Harris, is, of course, a woman. And I'm sure she plans on running for president. So even if it's not Kamala Harris, I guarantee you in our lifetimes, we will certainly have the first female president. It's just a matter of time, but not a lot of diversity in the office thus far. Okay, so let's talk about the powers of the presidency. We talked about the roles of the presidency. Let's talk about some of their powers. Expressed or enumerated powers. We talked about this in context to Congress. There are enumerated and expressed powers for the president in the Constitution as well. Again, these are powers that are specifically given to the president in the Constitution, such as the ability to be commander-in-chief, control the military, to convene or adjourn Congress, maybe in time of emergency or to push something through, they can adjourn Congress. Or convene Congress, and the power to veto laws. These are all written in the Constitution. The veto laws, again, the president can refuse to sign a bill, thus essentially stopping it in its tracks. The presidents also have what we might call assumed or inherent powers. These are powers that the president assumes they have, excuse me, but are not specifically listed in the Constitution. And they often justify this increase in power by the phrase in the Constitution and others, the executive power shall be vested in the president. So a very vague statement, and the Constitution is full of ambiguity and vagueness, oftentimes exploited by the president to increase their power. The president also has what we call emergency powers, and this is somewhat intentional, right? The founding fathers were very deliberate in some areas, and this is one of them. They wanted the president to have fewer obstacles, I should say, in front of him or her, so that in a time of crisis, the president could take quick action, right? I mean, if you think about Congress is notoriously slow. They gotta go to the committee, they gotta vote on it, they gotta go through both chambers, and then it goes to the president, right? That could take days, weeks, months. If we're attacked, if I'm not even gonna give an example because I don't want to fearmonger, but let's say we're attacked tomorrow, we want someone who can make decisions like that, right? We don't want to go through necessarily the legislative process. We want someone who can defend us immediately, and the president has that ability because of the lack of obstacles, because of these emergency powers. And we've seen the presidents in the past use these emergency powers, sometimes in the name of protecting our nation, but sometimes in somewhat questionable ways, right? Lincoln notoriously suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, right? The right to appear before essentially a jury of your peers, because they're taking so many prisoners, it was impossible to do. FDR, harder to defend, especially today. Interned Japanese Americans during World War II. A terrible, terrible decision, a terrible executive order implemented by FDR, really rooted in racism. So emergency powers, while sometimes necessary to protect the nation, also have historically led to things we might consider to be horrible in the case of Japanese internment, or perhaps flirting on the edge of unconstitutional, like Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. So I mentioned executive orders earlier. The president does have the power to issue executive orders, and these are not laws, right? Laws are voted on and passed by Congress, signed into effect by the president. Executive orders don't have to go through all those hoops. Executive order is a rule or order simply issued by the president to an executive branch of the government and having the full force of law. So the president simply orders it. Okay, now that executive order, whatever it might be, there are some limitations, right? For one, it has to be supported by the Constitution. So the president can't just say, from now on, I'm king of the universe, right? That's not going to pass. It's not going to fly. It's going to be overturned by the courts. So it has to be supported by precedent. It has to be supported by the courts. But short of that, executive orders can be used for really any rule or order. And we see presidents do that sometimes when they feel like Congress isn't cooperating. We saw President Obama do that with immigration. We saw President Trump do that to reverse some of Obama's executive orders concerning immigration. And some of those were challenged in the courts, some were upheld, some were overturned. So executive orders are somewhat controversial. Now, if we look at the number of executive orders over history, they're actually on a pretty steady decline. Especially when you consider during times of crisis, like FDR, right, was the president during the Depression and World War II. He issued almost 4,000 executive orders. If you compare that to someone like Kennedy, a more recent president, or Obama, and this Donald Trump is not accurate. I have to keep updating it, every year he was in office. So don't remember that number specifically, but it is decreasing relatively. Obama and Trump both were criticized by the other side as overusing executive orders. Really, in the context of history, didn't use that many. Here's issued per year. You can get a better idea. Look how many Roosevelt issued per year, an average of 307 per year. That's almost one every single day. That's crazy. And then if you go down here, you look at more recent, Obama around 35, Bush 36. So it has decreased over time. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for lecture 9, part A. I will create and upload part B as soon as I can.